I would like to remind you that for more Microsoft Webcasts, you can go to microsoft.com/webcast. Thanks again for joining us for today's presentation, VisualBasic.net Soup to Nuts, Building a Multi-Tier Business Application. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Ron Kundis, Msdn Developer Evangelist with Microsoft. Ron, you now have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much, Colleen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session within our VisualBasic.net Soup to Nuts webcast series. This is actually part 21, and today's topic is building a multi-tier business application. So in today's session, we're going to take a look at all the things we've learned with VisualBasic.net, and we're going to review how to build a business application using a traditional design pattern, which is the dividing the functionality within an application into multiple tiers for a variety of purposes to help, but mainly it's really to improve developer productivity throughout the software development lifecycle. Now, this is actually the last session in our webcast series. Originally we had 22 parts, but one had to be dropped because of scheduling. So this is part 21, so it's the final session within our webcast series. I'd like to thank everyone that has attended all of our sessions during this webcast series. It's been a lot of fun, and hopefully you've learned quite a bit about writing applications in VisualBasic.net over the course of this webcast series. So once again, let's go ahead and get started here. In today's session, we're going to talk about building a multi-tier application. So before we talk about building one, we need to kind of define what exactly a multi-tier application is. And then we'll talk about the specifics of building a multi-tier application, which begins with dividing functionality into multiple tiers within our application. And then finally, we'll also take a look at a sample of how you can handle errors within this multi-tier application. So some best practices for how you raise errors within your application, trap for errors, and then how you raise that to the presentation tier so you can inform the end user if necessary. All right, so first of all, let's go ahead and just define what a multi-tier application is. And really and truly, a multi-tier application, it's really just a design pattern for business applications whereby you actually divide the functionality by purpose into separate tiers. Now it's important to point out here as well that this is also referred to as layers. So if you refer to a separate tier or a separate layer or even a multi-layer application, we're really talking about the same thing. And really what we're talking about is dividing the functionality of our application into these separate tiers. It's most commonly divided into 3 tiers, which I've listed on this slide. So typically what you'll do is you'll begin by dividing the functionality across a presentation tier. This layer of your application contains all the functionality for displaying or updating the user interface. And then the second tier that you'll put common functionality together in would be a business tier. And this layer of our application actually contains all the functionality for implementing and validating any business rules we have that go along with the application that we're building. And then finally, the most common layer of an application would be a data tier. And this contains all functionality for communicating with any of the data sources that our application relies upon. Now, it's important to point out here that I actually describe this as building a multi-tier application instead of building a 3-tier application. And the reason for this is that sometimes we may actually take one of these core tiers that I've listed on this slide, and we may actually even further divide it into separate tiers for various reasons, maybe reusability or maybe maintainability or what have you. But basically, take for instance where maybe you have a product business tier and then you have a product data tier, and then maybe you break it down into additional tiers from there because of maybe your organization's environment. Maybe the data sources are mostly different, so you have to divide that into multiple tiers there. So that's why I actually describe this as building a multi-tier application. But I mean, really and truly, you start off by building 3 tiers, and then you only further divide that as necessary depending upon the exact circumstances and the exact environment in which your application will run. So we're mainly just going to cover breaking it down into 3 tiers. Just wanted to point out that the techniques we walk through in this session can actually be applied to break down one of these 3 core tiers into additional separate tiers as well. And so when we talk about dividing functionality, well, first of all, let's kind of define the problem statement. I mean, why exactly would we want to break down our functionality into these separate tiers or these separate layers within our application? Exactly what do we get out of dividing this functionality? So in a lot of cases, what you may do is you may actually take some of the techniques we've learned in this webcast series, and you may go ahead and build a web application. And then when you're first starting off, probably what you'll do is you'll just, directly on the ASPX page itself, you'll have user interface code where you display some controls and you handle a user clicking a control for a particular purpose within your application. And then you may even write some code on the code behind page that'll go and query the database when they click on that control, and then populate another control based on the results of that query, or things of this nature. And when you're first writing your applications, this may seem all well and good until something changes. One of the requirements within your application changes, and then you quickly find out that, whoa, wait a minute, this change, in order to make this change work, boy, I've got to change my HTML code on this page, and then I had some related JavaScript code that kind of correlated with that, and then I had to change the code on the code behind page and things like that. Now, when you're building simple applications at first, this may just seem like normal routine or whatever, but it really introduces a problem, especially in an enterprise environment, or especially in an environment where you're trying to build reusable components that you can just drop in to other solutions, or maybe even in other parts of your website. You may find yourself writing the same type of code. For instance, writing that code to access that SQL Server database. Boy, that may seem to get tedious because it's the same code that you're adding to every page. And once you do this a few times, you'll probably start asking yourself, boy, there's got to be a better way to write this code once and then reuse it throughout these different web pages. And so that's when you really start thinking about, maybe I should divide my functionality into separate tiers or separate components so that I can improve my productivity during the software development lifecycle, and then be able to share it across other applications, or share it across multiple web pages within my application, or even better yet, be able to write the code once and then make it accessible to other developers within my organization who may or may not be working on the same project, but may yet have need for the same functionality you've already written. Now that's when we really start to be able to take advantage of dividing this functionality into multiple tiers. And then that's when we really start to see an increase in productivity when we're building out our various applications to use across web applications, across other line of business applications within our organization. So some of the benefits that dividing this functionality provides us with is maintenance. So for instance, let's say that change came in for how a product needs to be queried out of the database, or needs to be updated, for instance. Where exactly do you go within your application to update that? Oh, I have to go to ASPX page 1. Oh yeah, we do product management on the admin side, on ASPX admin page, and then finally we do it on the sales page where we're confirming the shipping of an order or what have you. So you start to realize real quickly, oh boy, in order to change the way that this product is handled, man, I've got to change these 4 different pages and rewrite that code all over again, and then hope that it works and hope I didn't miss a spot somewhere across my application where where it's got the old functionality for the product and maybe I forgot to update that. Well, if I kept all of the business rules for a product in a single tier within my application, then I can just go to one spot within my application and modify the business rules for this product. And then any application that utilizes my business tier for implementing that business logic related to a product, all of the applications that reuse this tier suddenly gain the benefits of the new business logic that has been modified for how a product is handled within our organization. So it really streamlines maintenance of our applications, reuse as well. I can write the business logic in one tier and then reuse it across not only that single web application, but across any other applications that need to leverage the business logic for managing a product, that need to leverage that throughout other line of business applications that maybe not just the end user, maybe not just our customer uses our website to order from, but maybe then the shipping personnel can reuse the business logic within this product and within their line of business application that they use within the warehouse to confirm shipments of a product, for instance. And another benefit that we get as well is that it becomes easier to optimize certain areas of our application when all of the functionality for that specific purpose is contained in a single layer. So, for instance, if we find out that it's really taken too long to query product data from our data source, if we've encapsulated all of the functionality for data access within a single data tier within our application, then we know we can focus our attention on optimizing the code that resides within that single data tier. Once we optimize that code for increasing the performance of querying out product data, then any applications that reuse that data tier automatically get the benefits of the optimizations that we've performed within this tier. So really and truly, it improves our productivity and makes it easier to build other applications that can reuse functionality that we've already written, we've already optimized, and we know that we can go to make modifications in a single place in order to keep from hunting around of everywhere a product is updated, for instance. Not only within a single application, but across applications within our organization. So really and truly, that's where the idea of building out these multi-tier business applications come from, is in order to address the haphazard manner in which we needed to make changes in multiple places within our application. We learned that if we can encapsulate specific type of functionality into a single tier, we know exactly where to go. It automatically reaps the benefits of any applications that reuse that component. And then, of course, we can share this component out across applications and really streamline the development life cycle, especially for functionality that will get included in other applications. So let's talk about these three core tiers that we start with when we want to divide functionality. So the first tier would be the presentation tier. The presentation tier contains functionality for displaying or updating the user interface. So any functionality that is specific for presenting the interface to the end user would be contained within the presentation tier. So a couple of examples of this is, hide this button when the user is not an admin. Or when this selection is made in this control, populate this other control with this data. So really and truly, any code that needs to update the interface based on the current status of the application, or in response to an end user initiating functionality within the application, any code that actually modifies the interface or displays information in the interface or anything of that nature should reside within the presentation tier. And then the last point on here is that the presentation tier actually invokes the business tier for implementing any custom business logic that we have for our application. So this business tier contains functionality for implementing and validating any of the business logic that goes along with our application. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with defining the business rules for a particular application. And a lot of times, when you first start writing applications, you may have a tendency to just include this business logic right there on your web page, and it's kind of intermingled with all this of updating of the user interface and so forth. But again, a problem arises when these business rules change, and they change frequently, by the way. When those business rules change, boy, you have to update these business rules in several different web pages or across several applications. Well, if you've got all the business logic contained within this business tier, then you know exactly where to go to modify that business logic. So, for instance, you'll probably have business rules in your application that look somewhat like the examples on this page. Hey, if the order is shipped to this state, we need to add sales tax to the order. Now this could change. What if your company moves to a different state or opens another office in a different state, where all of a sudden you have to start charging sales tax for any order shipped to this state or to this new state where you opened up an office? If you had all the business logic right here in your business tier, you know exactly where to go to modify that business logic. Calculate shipping charge based on total weight of the order. Or maybe you have a business rule that says, if the quantity being ordered is greater than the quantity on hand, then I need to update the ship date for this order and set it to whenever my expected receive date for the next shipment of this product is, for instance. That may be a business rule within the logic for your application. So the business tier actually encapsulates all of these business rules and encompasses all the business logic for our application, and it all resides in a single tier, so that when we need to modify our business logic, we know exactly where to go, and it's all there together. And by the way, this is probably the layer that will change the most frequently, because if you're not used to building applications in a corporate environment, you'll quickly learn that business rules change on a very frequent basis. And so, if nothing else, at least separate your business logic into a separate tier. Even if you don't break it down into the other three tiers, at the very least, break down your business logic into a separate tier, because that is what will change most frequently. And if you don't do this, then maintenance will quickly become out of hand and hard to follow. And then finally, we have a core tier that contains all of the functionality for communicating within any of our data sources that our applications rely upon. So the data tier contains functionality for actually, executing queries, handling the results, and then passing back those results to the business tier. And by the way, the business tier is the tier that communicates with the data tier, and that design pattern simply allows us the capability to add any business logic necessary to any invocation of data when all of the data tier is accessed by the business tier itself. So, for instance, retrieving a list of products, updating the quantity on hand for product X, removing the product from inventory. These are just some examples of functionality you may implement within the data tier of your application. All right, so hopefully now everyone's got a good understanding of what we're talking about when we say dividing functionality into multiple tiers within our application. So let's actually go ahead and take a look at a sample three-tier application and what its different components are, so we can learn a little bit more about building a multi-tier application here. So I'm going to switch to a code sharing demonstration. Now my resolution is set to 1024 by 768. If your resolution is that or higher, you can press F5 on your keyboard to view this in full screen mode. Alright, so what I've done is, first of all, let me just kind of run through this application. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F5 to run this application. And what I have is I just have a sample enterprise application. I actually wrote this application more than a year ago to demonstrate at a live Msdn event. So by the way, I do live Msdn events throughout the country on a very frequent basis. As a matter of fact, I've done quite a few over the past month and a half. And so if you're interested in more presentations, kind of like these webcasts, but in a live format, then check out www.msdnevents.com and look for the next MSDN event that's coming to a city nearest you. But anyway, so I wrote this code for an MSDN event more than a year ago, but it still applies today. And I wrote it in traditional 3-tier fashion, where I've actually got the functionality for all the user interface contained in the presentation tier. And then so basically, this is just a sample app of where you might update products within your inventory, for instance. So it's a Windows application. For instance, I would select a specific type of product category, and it would query the database and populate my user interface. And then, of course, I've got the capability of editing that product down here in the lower pane of my interface here. And then, of course, you can see I've got functionality for adding a new product, for saving the changes to an existing product, canceling the changes once I begin an edit of a product, and then, of course, deleting a product. So it's just got some very simple functionality for managing products within our organization. But let's go ahead and take a look at exactly how this application was built. So we're going to begin with our main form. Our main form represents the presentation tier of our application. So the functionality that you'll see in this main form has to do specifically with updating the user interface within our application. So any of the functionality for updating the user interface can be found in here. Here you'll see within this load data section is where you'll find where we actually use the business tier component. The business tier, we invoke that business tier in order to retrieve a listing of categories for the product categories that we have within our database. So if I actually notice here, I'm actually using that using statement, so it'll automatically dispose of my data reader object once we're completed with it. You can see that basically I'm invoking the business tier to retrieve a listing of categories, and then that's going to give me a SQL data reader results. And then I'm simply iterating through the data reader itself to update the user interface. In this case, it's that combo box where you actually select a product category. I'm actually just iterating through this data reader to update the combo box that allows you to select a specific product category. If I take a look at this business tier component, so I'm just going to right click and select Go to Definition, then you'll notice that basically my business tier simply exposes the results from the data tier. So here you can see that I'm actually just going to use the try-catch block we learned about a few sessions ago. I'm going to use a try-catch block to basically invoke the get categories method on this product data component. Now the product data component represents the data tier for my application. Notice here too that really what's happening is because there are no business rules to implement for retrieving a list of categories, really all this method in this business tier component, all this method does is it simply turns around and invokes the data tier component. However, I did still implement this functionality in the business tier, and the reason is because if I needed to at some point come back and add business logic that would apply specifically to retrieving a list of categories, I could implement that business logic right here in this business component, and I wouldn't have to update any of the user interface code at all. Because the user interface code uses the business tier to retrieve a listing of those categories, keep it in mind, the presentation tier could have actually used the data tier component itself to retrieve a listing because, hey, the business tier isn't adding any value here. However, I'm planning for the future in the event that we may need to add business logic to the retrieving of categories. I went ahead and implemented this in the business tier, so now if the requirements change in my application and I need to come back at a later point in time and add business logic specific to retrieving a list of categories, I can add it right here to the business tier, don't have to update my data tier, don't have to update my presentation tier, and any application within my organization that utilizes this business tier component immediately gets the benefit of the new business logic that I add to this business tier. So that's why even though I'm not really implementing business logic for retrieving and listed categories, I still implemented it in the business tier so that I could come back and add business logic related to this functionality at any point in time. Notice here as well that that the business tier also contains functionality for updating data. So let's just talk about this. So here's an example of implementing business logic within a business tier component. So I've exposed an add product method that allows the end user to add a product to our data source. And so notice that, as you may expect, there are certain business rules that must be applied when adding a new product to our listing of products. So, for instance, we need to make sure that it has a valid product name. Now, these are some simple business rules. Obviously, the business rules you implement within your organization are probably going to be much more complex than just these simple little business rules I've added here for demonstration purposes. But I did want to show you some examples of what business rules look like, and how it looks like how it's implemented within this business tier. So I've got two business rules that must be applied. The product, it must have a valid product name, so it can't be blank. And then it also must have a valid unit price. So I am assuming, or I'm actually validating a product when you add it to our product database. It can't have a resale cost of 0. It has to have some sort of resale cost so we can display to the end user, for instance. And so therefore, I'm going to go ahead and validate this business rule. Now, the way that I've implemented this is I've implemented it with a flag. So flag is a true-false value, a Boolean data type. I think we talked about that in one of our first sessions when we covered data types. But basically, I'm using a flag variable here to denote whether all of the data, all the business rules have been met and have been validated before I actually invoke the data tier component to actually add this product. Now, keep in mind that too, you'll probably have these business rules validation at the database level itself as well. So for instance, when you're creating the table to contain product data, you'll probably have on there, on the actual column that contains the unit price, you'll probably implement a business rule there that it must be greater than 0, for instance. However, if you implement it as part of the business logic here, and it's implemented in the business tier, then you only have one place to update that business rule, and you can implement it here in order to take advantage of this business logic throughout other web pages, throughout any page that must add a product, for instance, or throughout any other application within your organization that manages product data. So here I'm basically just going to say, if these rules aren't met, is valid equals false, and then if is valid equals false, then it comes through to this else statement here, and here you can see that if it's false, I'm actually going to throw a new product business exception. This is just a simple little exception class, a custom exception class that I've implemented in order to, it's very generic, as you can see from this code. More than likely, I'd probably have some additional custom logic that's specific to this type of exception, maybe with additional information that we can inform the user of or what have you. I just wanted to point out, an easy way of creating a custom exception object so that you can use throughout your applications and really raise specific types of errors to your client applications that will be leveraging the components that you write. And then, of course, here you can see some various other functionality, deleting a product. As you can see, there really is no business logic to implement there. Here's another method for updating an existing product. Again, I've added some code to validate new data that's associated with a product being updated to ensure that it meets the business rules that we've implemented for a product. So whether you add or whether you update a product, it's going to validate these business rules. And then with a similar type logic, if these rules are met, then it's going to invoke the data component, invoke its update product method. And if I go to the definition of this, you can see that I am now in the data tier, and the data tier contains all the functionality for communicating to the database. So in this case, in the case of updating a product, I'm going to execute a stored procedure that exists in my data source. Now, one reason that you'll want to implement this data tier is that you can completely encapsulate all of the logic associated with communicating to your data source, so that if at a later point in time upper management or the powers that be, whoever that is, decide that, you know what, I don't like this database server, let's start storing all of our data in XML files in the file system, which is a questionable call in that nature. But let's just say it happens. I've seen stranger things happen. What would you do? What would you do? If you actually communicated with your database on all of your code behind pages and all of the files in your web application, boy, you've got a lot of work ahead of you. If, however, you have encapsulated all the functionality for communicating to that data source within this data layer, you have one place to come and update all of your data code. So, in this example, you can see I am specifically storing my data in a SQL Server database. And so, therefore, I'm using ADO.NET and the associated objects that are contained within the ADO.NET namespace to successfully communicate to a SQL Server database. And accordingly, I'm using the appropriate syntax for communicating. Now, we actually covered VB and SQL Server in a previous session. There are 15 different ways to skin a cat when you're communicating with a database. This is just one of the ways that you can invoke a stored procedure, execute that query, and retrieve results for a query. Oh, actually, this one is execute non-query, so there actually are no results. But anyway, this you can see that my update product method in my data tier, it doesn't have any business logic in this. It basically just executes a procedure that's contained within my data source for updating a product's data against that data source. Now, if someone came to me tomorrow and said, well, we're ditching SQL Server, we're going to XML files in the file system, how would you store that data? Well, you'd have to, reconfigure exactly how the data is stored and so forth. But you could basically just comment out all this code, or add a new method, update product XML, or whatever. Add the custom logic for communicating with, storing that data in the XML files in the file system, and then querying it out. So you would basically change the update product method. And then, of course, you could change these other methods, add product. Here, let's minimize some of these so you can see them all at once. Add product, delete product, update product. And then, of course, the data tier also has functions for retrieving product data from the data source as well. So here you can see get full product details, get products by category, and some others. There's that get categories function that we kind of looked at a moment ago for retrieving and listing of product categories. Here's a private function for retrieving the connection string from the settings for my application and so forth. So as you can see, this data tier component contains all of the logic relating to communicating with our data source. So let's actually take a look at this in action. Let's actually go ahead and hit F5, and let's see what happens when I let's actually try to add a new product. And here I'm going to say new product, and I'm going to keep it with the unit price of 0. Now remember, business logic within our application dictates that products must have a resale cost of higher than 0. So if I don't modify that value and I actually click Save, then what happens is is the the business tier actually, it did not pass the validation for the business rules that we're implementing for a new product, and so it took that. It raised any of the business rules that have been violated or attempted to be violated with this operation. It raised all those messages to the presentation tier, and then the presentation tier just took that message and presented that to the user. So here you can see that the end user knows that, oh, the unit price must be greater than 0. Please correct the data before attempting to save. And then, of course, if I actually violate multiple business rules, the business tier component collates all those rules and all the violations of those rules, raises that as a message to the presentation tier, so the presentation tier can present that to the end user. And so here you can see, I'll just go ahead and hit new product, and I'll make it $4 or whatever, category 1. I'll save this. You can see changes made successfully. 1 row is affected, and then of course, if I was to query out from category 1, here's the new product. And now that you see that I'm no longer in edit mode, I've actually assigned the actual product ID that was assigned, and of course, display the last update to the end user there. And that kind of brings us to the next topic, and that is handling errors within a multi-tier application. So we kind of learned about this a few sessions back when we talked about handling errors in class modules. Errors are handled inside the tier, or it's raised or bubbled up to the calling tier. So you kind of have 2 options. Errors that are handled inside the tier. So for instance, let's say that in your data tier component, let's you try to update a product. That product update statement actually raises an exception that the data source is not currently accessible. Let's say the SQL server goes down. You have a couple options. Well, one, you could raise that error to the end user and give them a corrected error message, or a custom one saying, hey, data source is currently not available, or what have you. Another option that you had, where you may want to handle it inside that data tier itself, maybe you have a backup data source. Maybe you say, if primary data source is down, then use this connection and try to connect to the backup data source. And so therefore, you may not ever raise that message to another tier within your application. You may handle it right there inside the tier. You may dynamically switch to the backup data source and then try the operation again. And if that's successful, then the rest of your application doesn't even know anything happened. So that's what I mean by errors are either handled inside the tier itself where the exception occurs, or it could be bubbled up to the calling tier. And so, the reason for this may be different. So, for instance, within your business tier, maybe you say, order shipments cannot exceed a certain weight. So the business tier itself, maybe it breaks it into multiple shipments. So that's an example of not just a data-related error, but maybe a business logic that needs to be implemented. Because for some reason your company can't ship out orders that exceed a certain weight. And so therefore, the business tier will actually break that into multiple shipments before it adds it to your data source or something of that nature. And then alternatively, an example of an error that needs to be raised to the presentation tier. Maybe they try to order something, and because it's a system that's being used by 100 different people all at once, maybe by the time where they actually place the order, maybe one of their items is no longer in stock. Well, in this case, you really need to inform the user because you can't handle that tier. You have no idea what they want to do. Do they want to cancel the order? Do they want to wait for all of their items to come in stock and ship it in a single order? Or do they want to break it down into multiple orders or whatever? So in this case, your business tier would actually have to raise it back to the presentation tier, and then the presentation tier would have to present those options to the end user. One of the items you selected is no longer in stock. It will delay your order. What would you like to do? So if we take a look at, we kind of already saw this in practice a moment ago, but let's actually take a look at the code that handled raising that business logic to are raising that business rule validation failed, raising that error message back to the end user. So let's go ahead and take a look at this main form design, and let's go ahead and take a look at trying to save a product. So here we've got trying to save the changes to the product details. So basically, if it's a brand new product, the save actually handles the add or the update. So basically, if it's a new product, we'll invoke the product business tier to add a product, passing in the values from the presentation tier. So these are just controls that are presented to the user that they fill out in order to enter in the data that's related to a new product. And then the user interface, the tier, the presentation tier, it passes that data into the business tier, into that add product method. And if we go to that, this is the one that we kind of walked through a moment ago. Try to validate the business rules. If it's valid, then we add the product. Otherwise, we throw a business exception. Now, notice how what we're doing is, as these business rules are violated, we actually add that to an error message that we are accumulating. Because it's kind of frustrating for the user to go through and they try to add a product. And, oh, I don't have a unit price. Okay, you go and fix the unit price. Then you try to save it again. Oh, it needs a product name too. It's just not a very good practice. It's an easy way to frustrate your users. Really, what you should do is try to validate all the business rules, and then any of the business rules that are violated, present all of those errors to the user to let them know that they're going to have to fix X, Y, and Z before this operation will work. It's really just a better way of doing it. And so that's what we're doing here. We're just validating these business rules. Any business rules that don't pass validation, we're appending that to a string, and then the string is passed into our product business exception, and it's thrown as an exception. So now if we go back to this operation, we're actually in a try-catch block. Notice that that we catch a specific product business exception. I've just demonstrated, even though the logic's not really different within this application for how we're handling a data access exception versus a business rule exception, I've broken it down into specific types of exceptions here to easily demonstrate how you could add custom logic for a specific type of error in order to give additional information to the end user on what they need to do in order to ensure that this operation is successful. So really, that's just one technique for raising these error messages to the user and kind of how you handle errors within our application. Also notice here too that if we go back to the business tier, and right now, if a data access exception is thrown, so for instance, we try to invoke the data tier, maybe that SQL server's down or whatever, it would actually throw a data access exception. Notice here in the business tier, I'm just throwing this exception back to the presentation tier, but I could certainly add custom logic. Maybe I try a different component that's a remote data access component or something like that. So if there's a problem with the actual data operations themselves, I can catch it specifically as an exception here, and then I can add some custom logic for trying to handle this error within this tier if I wanted to. And then, of course, I could go to the product data tier, and I may actually have, instead of just throwing a generic data access exception, I may actually implement logic here. Maybe this is where I try to say, oh, well, this data source can't make a connection. Let me try my backup data source connection or whatever. So that's an example of doing that. So, really and truly, we've reviewed kind of the different tiers for a multi-tier business application. This one is really just a 3-tier application because I've just divided the functionality into my presentation tier, which contains all the functionality for displaying or updating the user interface. And then I've shown you the business tier for implementing business rules for any of the data that our application depends upon. And then finally, I've shown you the functionality that would be contained in a data tier, which contains all the functionality for communicating to our data sources. So with that, let's go ahead and fire up the so here's a great question. Do we mean in-tier applications? And the answer is yes. You'll hear it referred to as 3-tier, multi-tier, N-tier, the N representing any number of tiers. Remember, I told you that the most common practice is to divide it into 3 different tiers for your application: a presentation, a business, and a data tier. However, in certain scenarios, you may need to break down the data tier into 2 separate tiers for certain circumstances. Therefore, you will also hear this referred to as an N-tier architecture, a multi-tier architecture, a multi-layered architecture, an N-layer architecture. So yeah, some of these terms are really kind of thrown around synonymously, but we're really talking about the same thing. What we're really talking about is dividing functionality into multiple layers within our application for code reuse, code maintenance, and optimization purposes. So here's another great question. Can the business tier be saved at the SQL Server level as a stored procedure? And the answer is yes. Well, actually, I believe you mean the data tier, actually, right? So in a lot of cases, people will actually implement the data tier as stored procedures so that they can keep the data functionality as close to the data source as possible. I would probably still recommend having a data layer that invokes those stored procedures because within a data layer component, you could do things like, oh, this data source is down, well, let me go to the backup data source and try that, for instance. If you keep all of your data layer code at the data source level, then you don't have a chance for automated recovery operations, for instance. There are a couple other little tips and tricks for that, but that's one reason why you may or may not want to keep all of your data tier code directly at the database level. I would still recommend building a separate component that would then invoke those stored procedures. That would be your data layer component, and then you could add functionality for, maybe if they're currently not connected. Maybe you save all the data, save all the changes into local files, and then when they reestablish a connection, then you batch update all the changes they made back to your centralized data source. That's another great example of where a data layer component would actually come in handy over just implementing that logic directly at the database level. So I've got another question about the sample application. Clearly shows user interface, business logic, data access layer, calling stored procedures with transactions, both VB.NET and C#. Well, this is a series on Visual Basic.NET, so all of my samples are in VB. And the sample that I just walked you through I'll be posting, and it actually contains examples of everything you've asked for except for the use of transactions in ADO.NET, which I can certainly try to point you to another resource. And then we have another question here that says, where should business logic be located in the application or in the database or in both? Please point out advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, so you'll struggle with some of the trade-offs on containing the business logic in the application and/or in the database itself. The advantage of having business logic in the database itself is to ensure that no data gets added that really is invalid, even if the code in your business tier forgot to implement that specific business rule. So for instance, remember how I told you that you may actually have a constraint on that column in your data table for that product price, and that constraint would prevent a successful addition of a record in that table because the unit price column wasn't greater than 0, you could certainly implement that as a constraint on that column in that table at the database level. And then, of course, you might implement that business logic within your business layer. The problem with having those business rules in 2 different spots is, remember, for maintainability, you have to update it in both spots as well. So the advantage is that with double checks layer, you certainly won't get any data that's really considered invalid according to your business rules. And of course, the disadvantage there is you would have to update that into 2 places. It's going to be all about trade-offs. It's going to be all about ensuring that you need to make sure that if you're going to implement it in your business layer, that all applications that update that data must do so through your business layer. Because what happens if someone else writes a web application that modifies products and they don't use your business component and they just update directly to the database with their raw code? If you didn't have that constraint on that column, then they could certainly add a product with a unit price of 0, and that would kind of mess up some of your business rules elsewhere across your organization. So it's really important to note here that if you're going to divide functionality into these multiple tiers, you really should also ensure that the individual tiers implemented as components or classes can be reused across your organization, so that you ensure that any applications are adhering to the proper business rules. And so another great question, in addition to using the data layer with the form in this project, do you also use it in other forms that reference product data? And do you use it with SQL reporting to gain access to product data for reports? With SQL reporting, you wouldn't necessarily have to use this product data layer simply because most reporting is read-only. So I wouldn't actually implement this product data layer in order to query out SQL reporting, but I would certainly use this data layer with any applications within my organization that needed to update product data. And so it's a good or a bad practice of implementing business rules in the database, constraints on tables in SQL Server, for instance. Unfortunately, there's no right or wrong answer here. Me personally, I think it's a good practice to implement constraints on tables and columns. The downside is that you have to update those constraints as business rules evolve. But to me, if there's any possibility that an application will update that data without using my business layer component, then I want to ensure the validity of that data at all costs. You might get differing opinions from different people based on their individual experiences. And if I wanted to highlight required fields using a star by fields that are required or don't meet a rule, what do you suggest for passing information between presentation and business layer? What you could do is you could actually pass that back in the error message itself, and then your presentation tier could actually go through and parse out. So, for instance, you could pass back a listing if you wanted to just highlight the ones with an asterisk and highlight it in red, for instance. Then what you could do is from your business layer, you could iterate through the different fields for that product that did not meet the business rules, and then in your presentation tier, you could parse through those values and then know which controls to highlight with that asterisk. And then you could give them a generic message like, some of the fields did not meet the business requirements. Please check all fields that are highlighted with an asterisk, for instance. And then let's see. I've got several more questions here. Let's see. I think I've actually noticed. Do I need to have all these tiers code if I go for Enterprise Library? That's a great point. We didn't mention the Enterprise Library within this session, and actually, interestingly enough, The code that I used for this session that we were doing at an Msdn event was actually a session on the Enterprise Library, and it showed how I can convert a traditional 3-tier application into an application that leveraged the Enterprise Library for implementations within these different tiers for easy access to things such as logging and things of that nature. So we didn't mention the Enterprise Library, but I would definitely suggest that you check out the Enterprise Library for .NET-based applications and implement the Enterprise Library. It'll actually make it much easier for implementing these different tiers. And as a matter of fact, the Enterprise Library actually comes with a data tier for you. So you don't even have to write your data tier from scratch. You can just use the data tier that's included in the Enterprise Library for the functionality for communicating to different data sources within your application, and of course, utilizing built-in configuration for easily changing among .NET providers for your data sources and things like that. So, yes, the answer is yes. I would definitely check out the Enterprise Library, and yes, the Enterprise Library can save you from implementing some of these tiers. Now, you'll probably still need to implement your own custom presentation and business logic tier, but the Enterprise Library actually includes a data tier for you, and you can use it right out of the box. Yeah, I'm going to post this code shortly after this session today. And yes, this session can work on both VB.NET and ASP.NET. In ASP.NET, you either build a separate dynamic link library that you add a reference to in your web application. You would do this if you need to reuse these components across applications. If you only need access to this functionality in a single web application, you can implement it as a class in the app code directory for a web application. But yes, these techniques apply to smart clients, Windows applications, as well as web applications. As a matter of fact, one of the primary reasons we kind of started adopting this practice is because of the high scalability needed and high code reusability needed for complex web applications. That's really what got this whole technique thing started. And it looks like when would you consider converting the data tier and or the business layer to services? That is a great point, Bill. And my answer to that question is, well, if you are implementing a service-oriented architecture where maybe even your vendors may need access to your business logic for certain operations, I would certainly move this from a component to a service-based to a service that can be leveraged by your vendors too. So for instance, let's say that you have third-party providers for some of the products that you sell on your website. And you need to ensure that when they make these third-party products available to your customers, you need to ensure that certain business rules are met before they can be made available to your customers. I would certainly move that business layer to a service that can be consumed by that vendor. Therefore, you can ensure that all of your business rules for a new product are validating through your business rules because you're forcing them to use your business layer service before they add products to your inventory, for instance. It's just an example. But certainly these techniques, I've mentioned component. We've already talked about in this series, I think, that a web service is nothing more than a component that can be invoked over standard SOAP and open protocols, standard SOAP and XML. And then I think the last question that I haven't answered here is, don't you have to upgrade Enterprise Library to the next version? Yes, there is a new version of the Enterprise Library out. So just you can get the latest version by just going to msdn.microsoft.com/practices. Okay, so I will stick around for a little bit longer. Let's go ahead and wrap this up so that we've already 1 minute over. So let me make sure that I'm being respectful of everyone's time. So we reviewed what exactly a multi-tier application is. Again, this is known as N-tier, multi-tier, 3-tier, multi-layer, N-layer, 3-layer. There's a lot of different terms, but basically it just takes into consideration dividing the functionality of your application by purpose into separate tiers that can be reused across multiple applications within your organization. We also showed a technique for how you can handle errors within this type of architecture and properly display that to the end user with the presentation tier. So once again, this was the final session in our webcast series on Visual Basic Soup to Nuts. I would like to thank everyone. I see a lot of recurring names here in the question manager, so I appreciate everyone's great feedback on this. Now, as far as what's next, I'm not really sure. I'm probably going to do another series because I really like this series format, and I love that so many people came to every session in this series. So I really appreciate your support. If you have any ideas for topics you'd like to see covered by a webcast series, feel free to shoot them to me. That would be ron.cundiff@microsoft.com, or it's accessible via my blog as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Colleen. Sorry I'm 2 minutes late. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ron. I just would like to remind everyone that I'll be putting up a survey in a moment, so please don't log off just yet. And I'd like to let everyone know for upcoming and previously live webcasts, you can go to microsoft.com/webcast. Also, I know Ron mentioned if you have any content ideas for him, but if you have any general content ideas, you can follow the fourth bullet point and submit some right there. And also, by filling out today's survey, you will be entered in to win a Microsoft Zune digital media player. So hopefully you're all seeing the survey in your slide area now. If you could take a few moments to fill it out before you log off, we appreciate your feedback. Simply follow the links provided to complete the evaluation. Also, if you would like a copy of today's presentation, you may print to PDF by going to the File menu in the upper navigation bar. Okay, great. Well, again, I'd like to remind everyone to please fill out that survey before logging off. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to Ron for his presentation. That does conclude today's live meeting. Thank you all for joining us. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of this event.